So the title of this series is just Cultivating Christian Mindfulness. This is largely a series that I put together some months ago and presented at my own church, which is St. Stephen's Episcopal Church across the street from First United Methodist. I think, as you may know from the email that came out from Jenny, I've been leading grief support groups at First United Methodist since 2007. I worked with Bill Mooney before he left, and then he asked me if I would continue that, and I've been happy to, and it's been a great blessing to me to work in that capacity. I've also been a student, I guess, or a user of various Christian meditative disciplines for about 30 some years. And I'll talk more about them as we go along. So what I'll be talking about today is building on my own experience of those traditions and drawing on others. We'll also be doing a little bit of practice through the 4 weeks. Every week I have just a brief 5-minute practice, and it will begin and end from a bell. So what I'm going to do is practice the bell and make sure that you can all hear it.
Is it possible for me to mute myself?
So this should be a 3-chime bell that you should hear. And if you, well, since I only see some of you, if those of you would thumbs up, Luann and Phil and Marlena, and just thumbs up if you hear it. If you don't, thumbs down. So are you okay with that? Okay. Okay, great. I see thumbs up across the board. That I find that encouraging. So, and I'll just assume everyone else can hear it as well. I'd like to begin with a brief prayer. And what I'd like to do is just invite you all to close your eyes, and I'm going to repeat 5 phrases that are essentially taken from this psalm, and they're just shortening it each time. So we'll take about 30 seconds and do that. So if you would, just sit comfortably and close your eyes for a few seconds. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am. Be still and know. Be still. Be. Amen. Just take a breath, let your eyes open, and we'll begin. What we'll be doing over today and the next 4 weeks is I'll be talking some about, just in general terms, what mindfulness is and what it isn't, ways that mindfulness helps people cope with life stresses. And perhaps some of you have noticed there are some stresses in our lives today. I'll talk about the roots of mindfulness practices and Christian traditions, and they go back a long way. And we'll talk about some of those. And throughout the 4 sessions, I'll be trying to introduce some very simple methods for cultivating a mindful approach to life and for deepening our spiritual practice. The framework I use is thinking about mindfulness from two standpoints. The first being mindfulness practices that are aimed primarily at our physical and mental and emotional health. And those are often termed secular mindfulness because they're separated from any religious or ethical considerations. They're just intended to help us become healthier people. The second orientation are specifically Christian mindfulness. Sometimes I will refer to them as contemplative prayer practices. And those have many of the same benefits that simply health-oriented mindfulness practices have, but they go then beyond. And we'll talk about ways that they do go beyond. I'm also going to talk about from two standpoints of mindfulness practice. The first are simply informal methods of simply being aware of everything we do, ranging from listening to eating, to washing the carrots, to cleaning the bathroom, bringing our bringing our awareness to everything we do. And I'll be referring to those as informal. They're sometimes talked about as mindfulness in action. The second group is formal practice, and that involves taking time every day or as often as possible to intentionally focus on some object of focus. And that will be, in some cases, the breath or body sensations, sounds, a word or phrase, and different techniques and different teachers will emphasize different concentration foci. So I'll be coming at it from those two standpoints of everyday mindfulness and Christian mindfulness, and then from the standpoint of informal versus formal activities. So what brought me into this and what was the main focus of my presentation a year ago was the condition that we find ourselves in, that the pace of change has dramatically increased. We are experiencing an onslaught of information from every side, from TV, from social media, from the internet. And along with that, you may have noticed some disinformation. That seems to be the name of the game right now in a lot of places. And the result of this is that some people find themselves multitasking, and the phenomenon of what one writer calls continuous partial attention, that we never are fully engaged with anything, that we pay attention to one thing and have something else going on simultaneously. So when I gave this presentation a year ago, this was the main thrust of mindfulness. This was the main thrust of the experience. And one piece of artwork that seems to express that well is, I think, one that's familiar to most of you, the Scream, that seems to capture that sense of being deluged by too much from every direction. When I first talked to Jenny about this course, that was several months ago, and this was the state of the world. The state of the world has changed. And the reason it has changed, of course, is the coronavirus. So that while the forces that cause us to be pulled in many directions are still there in the background, what has moved to the foreground, is how we respond to the COVID-19 experience. And there are some things obviously we're doing. We're trying to wash hands. Some of us now are wearing masks. But what I hear many people describing is the experience now of vulnerability. People's anxiety levels have been raised. And for many people, there's a renewed awareness of how precarious our lives are. Uh, the concerns about our own health, the health of our loved ones. For many younger people, I'm old enough now that I don't have to worry about working to bring home an income, but many people do. Uh, Anxiety levels have skyrocketed, and many people, as a result of this, have been turning to techniques that may be helpful in dealing with our current condition. And one of them, of course, is mindfulness. When I first started exploring the topic of mindfulness, I did a Google search about 8 years ago, and there were 2 million hits for that word. Several years ago, I did it again, and at that time there were 42 million hits. And a few weeks ago, I checked, and now it's up to 118 million. And many of those are people, again, trying to find ways to deal with the current condition that we find ourselves in. So many people are now considering a secular mindfulness practice, that is, one removed from any religious overtones. And the types of reasons that people talk about is a desire to feel less anxious, to reduce that sense of being stressed out, and to sleep better. And then to go beyond that, to simply enjoy life more and time with loved ones. Uh, Presumably at some point, people will be getting back to work and finding ways to be more focused, and just in general, to enjoy life more. So if you go online and look for mindfulness, you'll just see all sorts of opportunities to do practices with the intention of perhaps addressing some of these. And I'll talk later, there's quite a bit of research that show that mindfulness practices can help in all these areas. People report significant improvements in all these areas. So it might be useful to talk about just what exactly do we mean by the term mindfulness. One person, one well-known teacher who's been practicing in the field of mindfulness for many years, put it this way, and that it is simply paying attention in a particular way on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. So the paying attention part seems pretty clear. It's just bringing our attention focused to whatever is happening right now, and doing so intentionally, on purpose, and coming back again and again to the present moment. And this perhaps is the hardest part, the non-judgmental part. Certainly, I and perhaps many of us, almost every experience we have, we put in the category of desirable or undesirable, enjoyable and not enjoyable, good or bad. Mindfulness is simply paying attention to what is happening without coming to those judgments. What mindfulness isn't, and there's a long list of things here: daydreaming, spending our time in the past, rehearsing the future. And of course, that's something that a lot of us are doing right now, I think, the rehearsing the future, because there's so much uncertainty of where our culture will be, where our society will be in the coming weeks and months. Doing something while being somewhere else. Okay, someone's got a phone apparently. Rushing through activities Is someone trying to talk to me? Okay.
We're just saying that we just heard somebody's phone ring and a voice machine going on. So again, that was just the reason we don't have control over who calls us, why it can be helpful to mute. So if that happens, we won't hear.
Okay. So eating when you're not hungry or not noticing when you're eating. Sometimes we can go through a meal and really not taste the food, and we'll be talking more about that. Obsessively watching TV or online news, ruminating on what might happen. It's awfully easy in these days to get on the TV and or on the web and start spinning off into all the possibilities. I think the tendency is to try to gain some sense of control, some sense of ground under our feet. I know I do that when I'm trying to make myself feel more secure. The problem, of course, is that only usually raises anxiety. So that, again, is not mindfulness. It's heading off into the future and wondering what's going to happen. Mindfulness is trying to leave thoughts about the past or the future and focus on what's happening right now, coming back again and again to right now. And you may have noticed that right now, as we sit here in front of our screens, we are perfectly safe. Barring an asteroid falling through the roof of our home, we are perfectly safe in the present moment. The present is also the only place where we can actually experience the enjoyment of life. As Garfield said, his friend says, "It's been a good day." Garfield says, "It has? Man, I should have been paying attention." I think all of us don't want to get to the end of our lives and say, "Man, I should have been paying attention. It went too fast," and a sense of having missed it. So mindfulness can help us return again and again to the present. So turning our attention to just specifically Christian mindfulness. Mindfulness is a term that's been used a lot in the past 20, 30 years in a number of fields, certainly the mental health field, simply mindfulness practices, sometimes associated with the Buddhist training and techniques. And Christians may have been hesitant to embrace that term of mindfulness practice for several reasons. The first was seeing it as a fad, and I've heard the term big mindfulness. And there's truth to that. Like many things, you can find all sorts of spurious claims on the internet as to mindfulness will change your life in ways that are probably not realistic. Perhaps seeing it as exclusively health related. And again, there are a lot of wonderful benefits of mindfulness practice, but it is not simply that. And seeing it perhaps as exclusively an Eastern religious or spiritual practice. And it's true that mindfulness has been part of particularly the Buddhist tradition for 2,500 years. There's a great deal of knowledge and wisdom that has been developed in that tradition. But there's also a great deal within the Christian tradition, and many people are simply not familiar with it. So I'm going to be touching on some of that as we go through. I'm by no means a scholar of Christian religious history, but I will mention some areas. So some of the reasons Christians may have been reluctant. That's beginning to change in the last few years. This was a web-based announcement 2 years ago of a National Mindfulness Day for Christians in Great Britain. And it's subtitled Exploring Mindfulness for Health and Mindfulness of God. So bringing together both. They held another one last year. They did not this year for obvious reasons. The timing was not good, but there is an organization in Great Britain called, I believe it's Mindfulness, Christian Mindfulness, perhaps, that are the sponsors of this tradition. Started a new tradition. In the last 2 years, several excellent books have come out on the topic of Christian mindfulness. One of them that I'll be drawing on quite a bit in this series is by Amy Oden. The title is Right Here, Right Now, and subtitled The Practice of Christian Mindfulness. And I believe this came out in 2017 or 2018. Amy Oden is a professor of early church history and spirituality at St. Paul's School of Theology in Oklahoma City. And I may be incorrect, but I thought that was a Methodist affiliated school. Jenny, do you know that one way or the other? Okay, I think it is. Amy Oden, if you go online, has a wonderful 30-minute YouTube video of a Zoom-based interview with a pastor of a church, I believe in Georgia or Alabama, that she put together. The title of it is Christian Mindfulness at the time of COVID-19. So if you Google Amy Oden, COVID-19 YouTube, I think you'll come across that video. She comes across very well. There's a lot of very, very good material in that. So if you're writing that down, Amy Oden, COVID-19 YouTube, we'll probably bring that up. It's about 30 minutes. A second source, and I'll be using this, I'll be referring to this sometimes in this series, is by a clinical psychologist named Irene Kragel. The website is themindfulchristian.net. And I would encourage you to take a look at this. Irene Kragel is on the faculty, I believe, certainly the health system at Calvin College in Michigan, which you may be familiar is a church-related institution. She herself is, I think I'm not sure what her denomination is, but she is certainly not of the Anglo-Catholic tradition. I would say she's certainly a Protestant. Most of the mindful literature in the last 30, 40 years does come out of the Anglo-Catholic tradition. So in the last few years, that's begun to be changing. The third source that I'll mention is a book entitled Selfless Love by Ellen Burks. She is a retired professor of nursing at Radford University, and her background is Presbyterian. She has been a lifelong Presbyterian, and she's talking in this book about seeing the divine in the context of a meditation tradition. She has been a practitioner of Zen meditation for the past 50 years. So she stands with one foot in the Zen tradition and one foot in the Christian tradition. She's very active in her Presbyterian church. She has published several books and is a very impressive lady. So those are three sources that I would recommend and that I'll be using throughout this. So how does Christian mindfulness differ from mindfulness in general? Amy Oden defines Christian mindfulness as the practice of paying prayerful attention in the present moment to God's abundant life. And again, there's the emphasis on attention, but in this case, couching it in the context of prayer. Simply the act of sitting before God in a prayerful posture of being open. And again, the emphasis is the present moment. But it goes beyond that to seeing God's activity in the present moment and participating in God's abundant life right here, right now. So it goes beyond simply health related. She goes on to say that Christian mindfulness practice is rooted in the most basic witness of Jesus, that God is with us right here, right now, no separation. Jesus proclaims the reign of God is at hand. And she says, if we pay attention, or as Jesus said, if we have eyes to see and ears to hear. And she interprets that as saying, if we are mindful. So I mentioned some of the reasons for pursuing a secular mindfulness practice. And we'll be talking about ways that mindfulness can help with these. For people who are drawn to a Christian mindfulness practice, these are the sorts of things that, sorts of reasons that people use, that Irene Kragel mentions on her website. So to simply become more attentive to God's presence in our lives, to move prayer beyond words and into a more intimate relationship with God. Some people talk about increasing their impulse to love and compassion. And and creating some space to hear God's voice. So these are the sorts of things that Irene Kragel describes that people have mentioned to her as reasons for learning more. Each of you may have your own reasons why you're tuning in today, and perhaps what your interest is in Christian mindfulness. It's probably a good idea to ask yourself that question. What do I want to get out of this if I am being drawn to a practice in Christian mindfulness? So I'd like to spend a few minutes doing a very simple practice. It's one that we'll be building on through the next 3 weeks of simply mindful breathing. Before I begin that, Jenny, I haven't heard from you, so I gather you have not gotten any feedback on chat.
Nobody has said anything on chat. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question of Steve right now, or would any clarification be helpful? If so, if you could unmute yourself and just speak, just because I can't see everyone. All right. And I know it takes a minute to do that, especially for those of us that aren't used to this mode of communication. But I'm not hearing anyone, so I'm going to assume, Steve, that we are good to keep going with your exercise. And then, remember, as Steve said, if you have questions afterwards, he is happy to stay. So it's not now or never.
Right. So what I'd like to do is I'll give a little introduction to this. We'll do the 5-minute exercise, and we'll use the bell timer to begin and end the 5 minutes. And then afterwards, I'd like to just hear from you all what how this was. What did you notice? So perhaps after the exercise, we can use chat, or we can undo microphones, however you want to do that, Jenny, however you think that would work. So why the breath? Many traditions have used the breath for several thousand years. It's convenient. It's always with us. It's easy to notice because it creates a slight movement in the body. So when you pay attention to the breath, you notice something physical that's changing in your body. It's very familiar. It's the first thing we do when we're born. It's the last thing we do before we leave this life. And we don't have to think about it. It works automatically. In the Christian tradition, and the breath is often used in some Christian practices, breath carries a particular meaning. The Hebrew term, I think it's ruah, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, and the Greek term pneuma, used in the Bible, both refer to breath, and they're often interpreted as spirit. So there is this connection between the physical breath and the actions of spirit in our lives. It's the basis of our life in God. The first action God did with Adam was to breathe life into him. God's breath breathing life into Adam. And particularly at this time when we're dealing with a respiratory virus that places our ability to breathe in such jeopardy, it can be a reminder that of how precious our breath is, and that we are held each moment in God's hands, that each breath is a gift. That can be a very powerful aspect right now. So I see that as one of the gifts that the coronavirus is giving us, is to remind us that we are held each moment in God's hands. So what I'd like for us to do is to take a few moments and just to get yourself in a sitting position with your spine straight. If you do not need your hands for your computer, perhaps put them in your lap. Some people find it's easiest to do this with their eyes fully closed. Some people prefer to cast their eyes downward at about a 45-degree angle and leave them partially open and unfocused. So whichever you feel more comfortable with. And then bring your attention to the breath wherever you experience it most strongly. For some people, that will be in the nostrils. For some people, it is in the rising and falling of the belly. For some, it may be in the throat. Just notice where your attention is, where you experience your breath most strongly. And then during the 5 minutes, just breathe normally and try to notice each breath. Some people find it helpful to pay attention particularly to the in-breath or particularly to the out-breath. Or you may find it easy to simply follow both in and out as they go, as they come and go. And when your mind wanders, and it almost certainly will, just bring it back to the breath without any condemnation, without any recrimination. The mind, that's what the mind does. It bounces all over the place. So be gentle with yourself. Just bring it back to the breath. Any questions about this before we begin? Okay, I'm not hearing anything, so not seeing the chat button light up. So let's go ahead and we'll try this for 5 minutes. And again, we'll begin with 3 bells. So if your eyes have been closed, just let them open gently and let yourself come back into the room. So I'd like to take a few minutes and just ask you through the, Jenny, how do you want to do this? Do you want to do it through chat or unmuting a
No,
mic?
let's go ahead and unmic and let's go ahead and take off the share screen, if that's okay. So that way we can see everybody. Can you do that?
Okay.
And then, let's see.
Okay, I have gone to gallery view, which does show everybody.
Yep. And that also has, so if anyone has a question or a comment for Steve, why don't you wave first? And then, so that way, is there anyone who would like to?
I would just ask, what was that like for you? What did you notice?
Who would like to begin and just share some of what that was like?
I'll go first.
Okay.
Thank you, Kathy.
Okay. Initially, I was thinking of the word spirit on my in-breath, and then the word gift on my exhale. But then my mind would wander. And there, just about a minute before it was over, I kept thinking of the words that God is with us right here, right now. And that was so comforting. So
Thank
that
you.
whenever I held on to those words, it was really, I don't know, it was really empowering, I thought.
So glad. Thank you. Thank you, Kathy. How many of you managed to to hold the breath without thoughts? I don't see a lot of hands going up.
Moments.
For a moment. Very good. That's what the mind does. The mind generates thoughts. Some people have the misconception that meditation or contemplative prayer is designed to eliminate thoughts, and that if we're thinking, we're not doing it right. But that's not accurate. We just, the mind thinks. Keep coming back again and again. Anything else you noticed?
5 minutes is a long time.
5 minutes is a long time. Yes. Yes.
Luann, if you, oh yeah, okay, you unmuted yourself. Okay, Luann, I think has a comment for us.
Well, I watched during this. I have a different experience. Everybody has a different experience, but I have a much different one. We were watching for our daughter-in-law progress and lack of progress as she survived the coronavirus, and then she died the 15th of April. So we learned the day we got back from the mission trip on the 30th, and the next morning we heard that at 10 o'clock at night, the next morning we heard she had 104 fever. So for 3 days, she could not get the fever down except with across-the-counter or a few medicines. No other medicines were helping her for 3 to 4 days by her doctor. And she kept trying to breathe. And as she was going through that, I got online to find out about what does one do when you're trying to breathe. Our son said, she said, I'm just taking shallow breaths because so I can get air and it won't hurt. But when I went online, there was a man, and I thought I put a bookmark. It's a YouTube demonstration on how to breathe. And he was saying, breathe in, and not hard, not particularly deep. I was noticing you said just breathe normally. So I was practicing, and you can go check it if I can find the source. So he said, breathe, this is your mouth closed. Breathe in. Then to breathe out, you hold your nose. And now I can't remember where you breathe out with your mouth or not, and it's confusing. So here's my point. I went right back to that process that he was showing, because the idea is that your lungs have to have the right amount of carbon dioxide and the right amount of oxygen for your body to function well. And
So during that 5 minutes, Luann, you were practicing that.
I kept going back to that.
Uh-huh.
Yes, and I was relating it. It's not only that we have to have it to breathe, we can regulate that to live better as you're demonstrating. But in the midst of, and instead of doing more damage, we can, if we get this regulation properly, we can survive longer till we can get to some more life-saving situation. So it's a health thing, but then it also keeps your mind not on the bad parts that would make you less spiritual, but keeps that life going with the spirituality and the health condition too, the physical and mental.
And I'm gonna interrupt here just for a minute. Sorry, just noticing that it is in fact 2:00. And so I know that Steve, we just wanted to honor that 1:00, the 1 hour, just for people to know that Steve said that he would stay. So if there's, more conversation, we can do that. But Steve, do you want to say anything to wrap up now, and then we can stay for additional questions if people like?
Well, just thank you, Luann. Does anybody else have thoughts or comments about this exercise? Okay. We'll be doing other 5-minute exercises using different Christian contemplative practices over the next 3 weeks. Let me go back to the shared screen and just let you know what we'll be doing next week. So next week, I'd like to spend some time just talking about the effects of mindfulness practice, a basic, not necessarily Christian, but certainly not exclusively not Christian, on health and wellness and what the research has shown. I'll spend some time talking about what I would call the rediscovery of historic Christian contemplative practices. And I mentioned those 3 books. Those will be my sources for much of this. And then we'll have a practice of one Christian mindfulness method. The way I'd like to end is with a simple prayer. And given that it's hard for us to repeat this online together, what I'm wondering is, Jenny, I'm sort of hitting you cold with this, but since you are our host, would you be willing to repeat these phrases for all of us, to lead, in essence, to lead us in this loving kindness prayer?
And do you prefer that I use the we?
No.
Should I use I, we, or all?
What I would ask you to do is say the 3 phrases. May I know God's love. May I know God's joy. May I know God's peace. And then may we know God's love. May we know God's joy. And then may all persons.
Okay.
So
just want me to lead.
If you would be willing to.
Be happy to.
Thank you.
So let us pray. May I know God's love. May I know God's joy. May I know God's peace. May we know God's love. May we know God's joy. May we know God's peace. May all persons know God's love. May all persons know God's joy. May all persons know God's peace. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you. So until next time, may you all be safe. May you all be healthy. And I will look forward to seeing you next time. And again, I will stay on until everybody is gone. And so if you have any questions or comments and want to talk to me, I'll stay on.
All right.
Otherwise, have a
Well,
good
just
week.
thank you very, very much, Steve, for taking this time to present things so clearly for us at a time when it's very necessary. So again, we'll be doing this for 3 more weeks. You can sign off as you would like. See you back again next week. Or if you have a question, Steve is here for that.